Hey guys, Mr. Mawson, post editing this lecture video. So long video, guys, 2 hours, which is probably about what it would be for a lecture if we didn't stop in class. But just know the editing's a little bit weird. I had a problem with my recording in Zoom when I was playing some of the videos for sound. So you'll see some weird edits where I popped in the videos as I played them, and you also see my webcams on the whole time, and I didn't realize it. So I hadn't really set this up before, and so anyway, kinks to work out when doing video recording. Anyway, so bear with me. If you see me in the top right corner of my webcam just chilling, or if I get up sometimes or something in the video when the video is playing, just ignore me. For the most part, just hear what I'm saying. Ignore my webcam and what's going on. If you're curious, yes, the stuff behind me, mini fridge, a workbench, I have an office. So that's what's behind me. And then some memorabilia for concerts and stuff I've been to, and a bunch of tech stuff is laying around. So if you're curious what behind me in my office, that's what it is. But I hope you guys enjoy this. I hope that this is helpful to you. Again, use this lecture, use it as a tool. Skip the stuff that you are confident in, and listen to the stuff again on repeat if it's helpful to you. Just let me know if this was helpful or hurtful, as far as I know that we're time crunched. These chapters are important, and I want to make sure you guys have as much time to hear a lecture as you can. So anyway, enjoy the lecture, and let me know how I can improve this in the future. I appreciate you guys. Hey guys, so we're going to do a lecture for chapter 11 for the nervous system. I'm going to go through it, all of it. So those that were in class, you're going to hear a lot of this again, but I'm going to go through all of it from start to finish, kind of take some time. We're going to do the questions, everything for Woo Clap. So just bear with me. Hopefully this is helpful to you guys, and you can look at this again to kind of help fortify everything we went through, because I know we went through chapter 11 in the nervous system very fast. So give me a second to share my screen, and we'll get started. So, nervous system, chapter 11. All right. So, again, nervous system can be broken down into main two divisions. Central nervous system, CNS, contains your brain, spinal cord, peripheral nervous system. PNS consists of nerve network. So, what that means, right? Basically, what that's saying is that's everything else. So, if you think of central nervous system as the brain and the spinal cord, and then everything that comes off of the spinal cord or from the brain would be peripheral nervous system. And that's what it's saying when it says, nerve network. Okay. So basically, again, everything outside the brain and spinal cord is peripheral. So here's that chart at the start again. Easiest way to is that one thing you want to make sure of is that sorry, I'm making sure I'm drawing stuff effectively. Yeah. So anyway, central nervous system, breakdown, brain, spinal cord, right? Peripheral nervous system. I like this chart too because we can break it down further. So peripheral nervous system gets broken down into a lot of stuff, but the big stuff again, right? Sensory afferent division. Afferent with an A is always sensory, okay? Right? And then motor, efferent, right? Requires effort. That division is about transmitting information from the central nervous system to the body. So again, sensory is about going basically up, right? CNS, you need to bear with me here. I'm not drawing with my mouse, but it's right. Sensory afferent up, central nervous system, or from the body. So meaning my fingertips, something, right? I'm sensing something. I'm touching something, whatever. I'm touching this mouse right now, my computer. I feel that sensation. That's my body sending a signal to my central nervous system to let me know something. Now, if I'm touching the mouse, I get the sensation of holding this mouse, right? And then going the other way, if I'm going the other way for motor, it takes effort, means that I get that signal. Now, my central nervous system, my brain tells my body, aka for me holding this mouse right now, drawing this, tells my body to do something. And that means move the mouse like this to draw these words. So that is the motor division. That's an efferent neuron pathway. So again, sensory going up is always sensory neurons. Afferent neurons with an A are always getting the signal and sending it to the brain for interpretation. The interpretation happens, and then that signal gets sent down a efferent neuron in the efferent division of our PNS and says, hey, body, do this. Okay. That's that, again, division. Okay. So, what do I everything's blue right now, but that's fine. We'll do black. Okay. So, making sure I'm doing stuff right. Technical difficulties, not really. All right, here we go. So format wise, right? We're thinking about making sure I'm drawing. So we go through that. We're thinking, okay, we go from sensory. If we talk about the sensory side alone, if we remember that we're talking about stuff going up, right? So if sensory is all about stuff going back to the CNS from our body, sensations, right? Then we're talking about two divisions there, somatic and visceral. Okay. Somatic, visceral. So visceral, you hear that word, you think of deep organs. Okay. Heart, lungs, stomach, bladder, sensation to pee, information from your heart, information from your lungs is going to be sent as a sensation up to my brain for interpretation. That's visceral. Think deep organs. Somatic, you think about awareness of movement. Okay. Like awareness of where my body is, skin, bones, joints, muscles, where everything is, right? That would be the somatic sensory. So somatic afferent division, visceral afferent division is sensations from deep organs, basically. Okay. So that's what that takes care of our sensory afferent division. So if you go that way, then you start thinking about, okay, the other way. So a breakdown motor gets broken down even further, right? Somatic, autonomic. Okay, which again, you can think of automatic. You hear autonomic, you think automatic. Well, what does automatic means? It means it's doing it by itself. We don't have to think about it. Okay, right? So if we look at somatic, somatic's where it stops. So again, this is motor efferent. It takes effort, meaning that the signal has to come down and do something. It takes effort to allow voluntary movements of skeletal muscles, right? So somatic, we are voluntarily moving. Somatic part of the efferent division means it's taking effort to move our skeletal muscles, move our arms, move our legs, me to move this mouse right now, do that sort of stuff. Autonomic means that we're not thinking about it. So that would be stuff that we don't have voluntary control over. It can be muscles like blood vessels and other things. In this case, the example they give us, blood pressure for blood vessels, heart rate, our heart. Those are controlled by our autonomic nervous system. So if you hear autonomic, I'm not going to write it out, but if you hear autonomic nervous system, it's talking about this autonomic motor or autonomic efferent division of our peripheral nervous system, right? You can see the stepwise steps we get here. So the autonomic nervous system is what is referred to here. If you hear autonomic nervous system, it's talking about these two divisions, right? Sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, we talked about this before, but again, I'm going through this like you haven't heard it before. Sympathetic arouses the body for action is how our slide tells us. But what this is saying that, hey, sympathetic is like fight or flight. Okay. Fight. Do F and F because I can't really write very well. Fight or flight, meaning arousal, heart rate increase, sweating, like something's happening. I'm being attacked by that dog or a dog's chasing me all of a sudden. This is my sympathetic division of my autonomic nervous system. I don't have to think about it, right? My heart rate increases. All these things happen in response to a stimulus, whatever it is. The same thing goes the other way. Parasympathetic is the opposite effect, has a calming effect, meaning this is the rest and digest, okay? R&D, rest and digest system, parasympathetic division. So what this is saying is after eating a meal, my heart rate will slow down, my gastric motility, meaning my whole GI tract motility will increase to help me have a bowel movement. Those sort of things. Urinary bladder can kind of relax so that I'm able to pee effectively. That's parasympathetic. So parasympathetic division, okay, of our autonomic nervous system is what is operating all the time. This is like the majority of normal day operation right here. I'm just do a star. Parasympathetic is normal daily operation, right? Maybe 80% of the time, whatever it is. Sympathetic is happening when we're working out, when we're running, or something happens that gets our alert system heightened, other things, or when we need to increase our heart rate, we need to do certain things like that. That's the sympathetic. But if you get a question that's asking you, say, hey, this section or this component of the autonomic nervous system is what controls normal everyday life, your answer would be what? Parasympathetic division. Okay. That's the normal controlling agent. Sympathetic comes in and it's a balance between the two, homeostasis between these two divisions. But the general rule of thumb is that our parasympathetic is doing the majority of the work. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. So Again, figuring this out. I haven't used Zoom that much, so you have to bear with me on this. Okay, so in that same regard, we'll go to our next slide. So next, likes to talk about our other cells. So, right. So neuroglia, or also known as glial cells. Okay, glial cells. And forgive my handwriting because I'm writing with a mouse. Glial cells, neuroglia. So what is basically, you break down our nervous system into two types of cells. These neuroglia, also known aka as glial cells or neurons. That's what we get. Now there's multiple types of glial cells you see down here in this list, right? But the big stuff is that we know we have neurons, and their only job is like the information, or not information highway. They're like the electrical poles of our whole body. You know, you have your telephone poles, electrical poles throughout your neighborhood, right? They're just sitting, they're going from pole to pole, sending a signal. That's what our neurons do. They go from pole to pole, sending signals. They don't really care. They go one way. They don't really care. They're not thinking. They're not doing anything extra, sending electrical impulses. Glial cells are supporting cells that do a lot of other things for the neurons, right? So, for example, oligodendrocytes here, oligodendrocytes form the myelin sheaths of CNS neurons. Okay. So, if you've seen before, but we'll look at the pictures that the PowerPoint has for us and the book uses. But oligodendrocytes are what are forming the myelin sheath in the central nervous system. So, they wrap around and form myelin sheaths of multiple neurons in the CNS, because in our CNS, especially the brain, we've got neurons on top of neurons, basically, right? And the same thing, we got Schwann cells here. Okay. They have, each Schwann cell has what's called a neurolemma. Okay. Try to write it here effectively, best I can. 2 M's, neurolemma. Neurolemma is basically the nucleus of these Schwann cells, and these run along the myelin sheath of peripheral nervous system, PNS, and they are what we'll look at in a second when we look at the traditional way a neuron looks. And they form, again, myelin sheaths, being myelin, protein that helps do that. But the myelin sheaths add help with impulse conduction, means makes the impulse conduction faster, and offer protection to the axon of the neuron, keep it safe from damage, that sort of thing. And they need the neurolemma of these cells to replicate. So Schwann cells kind of house a nucleus, because neurons can't replicate themselves. So we need the Schwann cells, especially in our PNS, our peripheral nervous system, to help to replicate new and help regrow neurons. If they get severed, they get damaged, that sort of thing. Okay. And that's what neurolemma do. And that's why oligodendrocytes ones, and we'll look at this again, that wrap around multiple axons of in the central nervous system, especially the brain, which means that if we have issues like injury to the brain, we have only like one oligodendrocyte has one nucleus. It can't replicate and help fix neurons like Schwann cells can in the PNS. Okay. So that's what makes central nervous system injuries so bad. Spinal injuries to the spinal cord or brain injuries is why it's lost. It's not going to regrow, and you'll have permanent loss, right? You know, in the form of paralysis, brain injury, stuff like that. The other big supportive glial cells, and a lot of these you'll want to see, astrocytes is one I would star. Astrocytes look like these green stars, but they form the blood-brain barrier, sometimes referred to as the triple B here, blood-brain barrier. And again, blood-brain barrier formed by the astrocytes is basically the astrocytes link up together and link up to an epithelial basement membrane, usually around the brain, and kind of only let certain things through. They're the gatekeepers to the brain and our central nervous system. They only let fluid like water and small molecules like O2 and CO2 that we need for normal everyday stuff, that we need for, you know, we need a lot of oxygen to do our stuff. Those are what the astrocytes, they're the gatekeepers. They only let those small molecules through. They don't let big stuff, which means medicines don't get through, hopefully preventing bacteria, foreign pathogens from getting through. But this is why the blood-brain barrier is what makes some treating psychiatric disorders tough, and other disorders that brain, and why you can't treat brain tumors really effectively with chemo drugs, because drugs and medications aren't going to cross the blood-brain. There are some that do and have a different mechanism of action, but the general rule of thumb is that medications don't cross this blood-brain barrier, and that is made up by the astrocytes. The other big thing about astrocytes, okay, most numerous, okay, most numerous. I have a hard time. Most numerous of our glial cells, okay. I'm trying to write numerous. Not doing a very good job. Most numerous is astrocytes. So there's your star, your highlight. The other ones are microglia, perform phagocytosis, if you remember that, cell eating. So microglia are there to eat anything around our nervous system or around our neurons that doesn't need to be there, pathogens, whatever. Ependymal cells line the spinal cord and cavities of the brain. What this is saying is they help with movement of CSF, okay? Cerebral spinal fluids. That's a bad C, but CSF, okay? They help the flow, all right? They have little cilia on them, and they help the flow of our CSF throughout our ventricles and through the spinal cord, okay? That's their main job. So also some of these cells, not all of them, will secrete CSF. So we need these cells to secrete some CSF, help flow of CSF. You think ependymal, you think CSF, okay? And let me erase this. So just as just as a kind of recap on the blood-brain barrier again, this is a picture right here. This green thing is a picture of an astrocyte. Again, astro meaning like star. It doesn't really look like a star to me, but I didn't name it. Okay, so right, but their big job again is form astrocytes wrap around capillaries. So they're wrapping around capillaries, forming a barrier to stop anything from moving out of the capillaries that we don't want it to, that our brain doesn't want it to, which in turn is usually going to be things like, again, medications, foreign pathogens. They're just going to let the small stuff through. Oxygen, CO2 for that exchange, and fluid shifts, okay? And that's what the astrocytes do, protect the brain from foreign substances, okay? It's a semi-permeable membrane. You imagine the astrocytes form like basically a cell membrane, a plasma membrane, a semi-permeable membrane blocks, allows small molecules and blocks big molecules, okay? Oh, whoops. Well, that just gave that question away. That stinks. Okay, sorry about that, guys. So, let's see here. So I think this is, I've reset this, but this WooClap is still showing stuff from before. But if we look at it here, okay, the most numerous of all glial cells are, and you've obviously already seen the answer, astrocytes again. Microglia are those phagocytic cells. Schwann cells are supportive cells that make up myelin sheaths of peripheral nervous system, and ependymal cells are in the ventricles of the brain, which we'll talk about, and in the spinal cord. That some of them will secrete CSF, and some will also have little cilia that helps the CSF flow, keep it from being stagnant. Okay. And so this kind of gives the rationale. Again, pervasive throughout the brain and form. So they form the blood-brain barrier. They're the most numerous cells. So if you hear anything that's asking you or ask you, hey, what's the most numerous glial supportive cell in the nervous system, and supportive cells being glial cells or gliocytes, or not gliocytes, excuse me, glial cells or neuroglia will be astrocytes. Okay. Lots of big words, I know. So neurons, again, there's the other half of it. We talked about the supporting cells, the neuroglia. Neurons are the other. They handle communication, and they have three classes. Again, handling communication, again, I like the analogy of neurons just being the lines of a, power pole, or lines of a, telephone pole, those kind of stuff. They handle communication. They're sending signals one way or the other. And we have three subclasses of neurons, and we've talked about two of them already when we talk about our different divisions of our peripheral nervous system, right? We have peripheral nervous system has signals that go up and signals that go down, and that's where these come into play. The signals going up, right? Afferent neurons, afferent with an A, afferent neurons detect stimuli. That's sensory, right? So sensation up from the body to CNS, okay? Interneurons connect pathways. So if you imagine there's got to be a connection here. If this neuron is going up, right, somewhere, you imagine the interneuron is the neuron here. I'm not going to be able to draw a neuron effectively that attaches this point from a right here afferent neuron getting the signal, and then the motor efferent, meaning efferent, efferent neurons that need effort. They require effort to happen. Motor function, they're doing something with an E. Efferent neurons relay messages. So this comes back down to the body from the CNS, which is where we find interneurons. They connect pathways. So mostly you're going to find interneurons in the central nervous system, which again, as a recap, is spinal cord and brain, right? Okay. Making sense so far, I hope. Okay, so moving on. Here's your big picture of the neuron structure itself. Okay, so we've got a cell body, dendrites, or dendrite would be the whole side, you can kind of call this, and the axon are the three main parts, right? Cell body contains the nucleus. That this would be your cell body, okay? All this. Dendrites is these projections here. You see these? They look like tree limbs, or they look like little tree limbs. Those are dendrites, and you would kind of consider this whole thing around the cell body as the dendrite end. Does that make sense? So we've got a dendrite end of a neuron and an axon end here. This whole thing down to here to this part is all axon, okay? Cell body contains a nucleus. Again, doesn't replicate, but we need a nucleus anyway, right? For these cells, because our neurons get made when we're born and they're around a long time. So we need a nucleus to, unlike red blood cells that have a short half-life, live like 140 days or whatever, or 40 days, 140 days, excuse me. Neurons are around a long time from birth on up, and we need them to work effectively. So that's why they need a nucleus. They need to do all the stuff. They hold genetic information, replicate RNA. They need a nucleus, but they don't replicate. So myelin sheath, that's showing us these are also what you would refer to, and this image of this neuron is an example, probably more of what a PNS, a peripheral nervous system neuron, would look like. And so these would be Schwann cells, okay? Here. Nodes of Ranvier here. Nodes of Ranvier is basically these gaps between the myelin sheaths here, okay? That's what you consider nodes of Ranvier. And basically, if you imagine like an electrical impulse, have any of you ever seen putting two wires together, or like a movie where they jump a car off or whatever, the two wires spark, okay? Nodes of Ranvier are a gap between the myelin sheaths that allow the electrical impulse. The myelin sheaths help make it faster. These nodes of Ranvier are like jumping off points. So the electrical impulse will like spark from here to there and kind of skip this gap between the myelin sheaths, and it speeds up the impulse, and we need that help as well. Synaptic knob here is this. Synapse is where these, and we'll look at a synapse in a minute. So synaptic knob is the end of the axon, but the biggest thing is this synaptic word, synapse, okay? You'll see that a synapse is basically where the end of one axon of a neuron, right, like this end here, connects with the dendrites, right, of the next neuron, and so forth. Here's your cell body. Here's your dendrites, right, connecting axon, and then the other synaptic knob of the next neuron that connects to another dendrite, right, and so on and so forth, if that's making sense. So that's the neuron structure. Big things is like at least knowing cell body houses the nucleus. Off of the cell body, I have these dendrites that are tree-like projections. And if I'm talking about the dendrite end of an axon, I'm talking about the end that holds the cell body and all the dendrites. Then the other big part is the axon, which is just the tail, including the synaptic knob and all the myelin sheaths around it. Okay, that's the big parts. If you're looking at a picture of a traditional neuron, and again, like I said, because these are likely Schwann cells and this is likely peripheral nervous system, this is not all encompassing, but this is your kind of general look. All right. So we'll try to erase that. So again, big thing is the big three parts: axon, dendrites, cell body. That's where the nucleus is held of a neuron. Okay. So moving on. So this is where it gets a little bit more in depth, right? So in the peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells wrap themselves around the axon, laying down multiple layers of cell membrane. You can see like this, excuse me, these layers here. Okay, they lay down a bunch of cell membrane. Again, protection, impulse conduction speeds up. So there's an inside layer that's got a nucleus, Schwann cell nucleus, and the layer that holds this nucleus on the outside is the neuralemma. Without the neuralemma and its nucleus, okay, of the Schwann cells, again, PNS, peripheral nervous system, right? Without this neuralemma and the holding the Schwann cell nucleus, without this nucleus, these Schwann cells, they can't replicate, okay? That's the outer layer is the neuralemma. It holds the nucleus. So it's essential basically for an injured nerve to regenerate. In the central nervous system, projections from one, so on the other side, one oligodendrocyte. So this whole thing, all this, right? All this. Here's the nucleus of an oligodendrocyte. Can't write nucleus effectively. And then it's got all these branches off to, in this picture, at least 3 other axons of other neurons, okay? And again, full of myelin, layered up to help with impulse conduction. But because the nucleus of the oligodendrocyte is just one, spread out and covering multiple axons, okay? It's located away from the actual myelin sheath. It's kind of hanging out on its own. No neurolemma. This prevents central nervous system, CNS, neurons from regenerating. So again, spinal cord injuries, brain injuries, you're not getting that function back, okay? So again, myelins increase speed of impulse conduction. And again, speed is important for neurons because I need to know the neuron to move my hand to do this and that, right? So this is your main difference. You talk about the myelin sheaths of the actual neurons. CNS has the oligodendrocyte. Peripheral has the Schwann cells in this structure so that they can replicate if there's an injury, because they need the nucleus to kind of help regenerate the rest of the axon and actually make the nerve come back. But in central CNS, that's not happening for us. It's a done deal as far as injury goes. Okay. So when neurons detect sensations such as touch or heat, and relay information about the stimuli to the central nervous system. What kind of neurons are these? Is basically what this is asking. Okay. So we have efferent with an E neurons, interneurons, afferent with an A neurons, or Schwann cells. I'll give you a second to think about it. All right. Hopefully you guys have your answers. And again, ignore this 24 and the result stuff because I think this is just, I reset this, but it's not reset, but I'm going to roll it anyway. So again, you're doing this at home if you're watching this. So what'd you get? Huh? Okay. What do we get? What do you guys think? Yep. It's afferent neurons. Okay. And again, ignore the numbers. I don't know why this didn't reset like I thought it would, but it is in a there. Afferent neurons. So again, sensory neurons, afferent, sending a signal of sensing something and sending it up to the CNS for interpretation. So when a neuron detects sensations is your keyword there. Touch or heat is just giving you examples of sensations. It relays that information to a stimuli in the CNS. That is the decent definition of afferent neurons, or also known as sensory neurons. The reason, again, I use afferent and efferent is not to try and confuse you guys. I don't want to, but what the problem is that a lot of places use both. So I'm going to use both. Okay. And again, this kind of gives you the rationale for that we just went over.
We'll go back to our blood pressure example here. Some neurons bring information from our organs to the brain. We call these sensory neurons because they sense things such as temperature or blood pressure or light from what we see or touch and bring that information to the brain. Most of our sensory neurons, like the one in my drawing, are unipolar neurons. So this first neuron is a unipolar sensory neuron. In this example, let's say blood pressure is too high again. And this sensory neuron, whose job it is to detect blood pressure, sends signals toward the brain. Once these signals reach the brain has to process the information and decide what to do. Making decisions, even unconscious decisions, such as regulating blood pressure, takes many neurons. We call these decision-making neurons interneurons. Interneurons are found in the brain and spinal cord, and most of them are multipolar, like the interneuron in my diagram. These neurons will compare the data they have received to the person's set point for blood pressure and make a decision about whether the blood pressure is normal, too high, or too low. Now that our brain's neurons, called interneurons, have made a decision, that decision is sent through a motor neuron to an effector, which could be a muscle or gland or any other organ in the body. In this case, the effector is the heart. Motor neurons, which take information from the brain to an effector, are usually multipolar. Once the heart receives the action potentials from this motor neuron, it will beat faster, causing blood pressure to rise back to normal. To recap, changes in the body are detected by sensory neurons, which send information toward the brain. The brain and spinal cord are made of interneurons, which process information and connect sensory neurons to motor neurons. Motor neurons then send signals from the brain to other organs to tell those organs what to do. At this point, you should know that a neuron is a nerve cell that sends information between organs in the body.
You can ignore this part here, the structural classification. All right. So that was more he talked about. We're going to kind of skip over unipolar, bipolar, multipolar neurons. I'm not worried about it. These are just different shapes depending on location, and they do have different functions, but they're all the same structure. You can see that they all have a cell body, or known as a soma, that has a nucleus. They all have dendrites. They all have an axon that ends somewhere. So they're just shape has helped with their function, but we're not going to stress about that too much. Okay. So impulse conduction, okay, caused by electrical current. Again, here's our option. So for this section, I'm not going to focus on impulse conduction. We'll go through the slides a bit and I'll mention it here, but I don't want you guys to stress about it, okay? Because this gets a little bit more in depth. But what I want you to hear is when you hear about impulse conduction, again, electrical signals, right? Messages being converted into electrical signals so that they can travel up a neuron and for our brain to do something with, okay? So basically, impulse conduction is a flow of charged particles from one point to the other. So whatever ions with opposite electrical charges, something that's positive, negative, separated by a membrane, whenever that happens, that potential exists for them to move toward one each other, be attracted, and that's called membrane potential. So when ions are electrically charged opposite and they come towards each other, and that exchange of their movement causes an electrical impulse, like a shock or like an arc jump to somewhere, right? The membrane exhibits membrane potential. Basically, again, excess positive ions on one side of membrane, excess negative ions on the other side. That is said to be polarized. So again, polarization is saying I've got membrane potential on one side or the other ready to ignite and create electrical signal, and this is how it happens. Okay, so we'll look at the slides, but I'm not going to stress about it. So again, neuron conducting a signal. These, like, again, this is showing us we got positive ions outside, negative inside. Okay, because the membrane is permeable of the neuron, right? Permeable certain things like sodium potassium pump. If you imagine this is, and you'll see here, right? Sodium on the outside, potassium on the inside. Potassium is normally an intracellular, meaning it's inside cells, including neurons. And sodium is an extracellular, meaning it's outside cells. And they create a membrane potential. When they move across the barrier, that is what's creating this impulse. Okay. So that's usually by a stimulus, right? Such as chemicals, heat, mechanical pressure causes these changes and readings to happen. So it goes from repolarization, impulse conduction. This is that process they call depolarization. Whenever it's polarized and all of a sudden, because of stimulus like chemicals, heat, neurotransmitters happening, this polarization happens. And that's what sends the signal. So if you look down, it just basically goes down a chain along the axon and then keeps up and then gets itself, reestablishes a baseline norm once the signal kind of stops making it fire. Okay. And that's all this is saying. I don't want you to get too wrapped up in depolarization, membrane potential, action potential. Okay. Those sort of things. Don't stress about it. Just this is where we're talking about the general concept. So if you want to think about anything, you think about how electrical impulses are made for the nervous system, right? It has to do with ions moving back and forth across the membrane of the neuron. That's how it happens. Okay. That's the biggest thing you could think of. Again, this is showing this. So this also shows us impulse conduction with the myelinated fibers. Okay. So what this is showing us is saying here, myelin kind of blocks the free movement of ions across the cell membrane. The only place that ion exchange can occur is in the nodes or Ranvier. So basically this kind of that's why the nodes we call these the nodes of Ranvier. The myelin sheath helps with impulse conduction, but it kind of acts like it makes this membrane potential basically jump like this, boom, 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 okay, between places, and that helps speed up conduction. So if you're jumping this whole segment all the way through, okay, that's going to increase your speed in which the electrical impulse makes it. And that's, again, neurons have to fire really, really fast, right? So this is the synapse. So this would be basically, you can see here what this is showing us that an axon, again, this is the axon end, connects to a dendrite end, and this is obviously very zoomed in, of another neuron and continues this action potential. But this connection is a synapse, this connection between where they don't necessarily touch, but given movement, again, calcium, I want to highlight here, we need calcium for basically just think we need calcium for this synapse impulse conduction to happen. Okay. So keep that in mind with calcium. Calcium exchange is important. You hear calcium all the time. I've harped about calcium always being around, so keep it in mind. But calcium is just a highlight. Neurotransmitter gets released. The neurotransmitter gets received by these receptors on the dendrite of the next neuron, and then it then see with the sodium continues the action potential. Sodium moving in, potassium moving out through the sodium potassium pump, and that's the big broad definition. Biggest thing from here for your exam and for you kind of studying is just a general concept of like, well, the big thing we require calcium to do this. It's about two ions moving across the barrier that creates an electrical impulse, and that starts from receiving information from the body, basically. Okay. Okay, moving on. So we talked a lot about the nerve structures and the neurons themselves. Now we're moving into the next section where it talks about our spinal cord. Good news is from this picture, right? You don't have to remember like where all the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral nerve plexuses are. Okay, again, this makes sense if you think about the regions of our spine. These are coming off our spine, so that makes sense. The only thing I would say here is that the interesting thing is that, well, one, okay, the name of like the tail, the bundle end of where this our spinal cord ends and kind of tapers off like this, almost looks like a horse's tail, and that's where quada equina comes from, like horse's tail or tail. That's the name of the kind of end portion of our central nervous system, spinal cord, so to speak. Okay, and then there's more nerves here, but this kind of branching area is the cauda equina. Okay, so again, spinal cord extends from the base of the brain. It's attached to the brain all the way down. Again, that's why in movies, sever cut spinal cord is just loss of function, death. Okay. So again, nerves from each of these regions kind of go different places, but I'm not gonna stress about that. One thing I'll say too is that our book talks about it, I think, on this page. If you look at your book, it talks about we've got um some stuff there to keep in mind. So one big thing is that for adults that are our spinal cord as adults generally ends around L1, okay, lumbar 1. So that's the safe space for doing epidural, safe space for getting cerebral spinal fluid, what they call spinal tap. Because maybe you need to get cerebral spinal fluid to rule out a meningitis diagnosis or rule out some kind of cancer. There's a lot of things you could rule in, rule out with cerebral spinal fluid samples. But in general, you think if someone's going to get a lumbar puncture, meaning they're going to try and attempt to go into the spinal cavity space and get some cerebral spinal fluid, they're going to do a spinal tap, and they're going to do it around L3, L4. So far enough away from kind of this L1 tail end of the spinal cord, so that if something happens, you're less likely to injure our actual spinal cord and cause paralysis or any other kind of conditions. But the caveat to that the book describes too is that as babies, our cauda equina, our tail end of our spinal cord, tends to run a little longer. It tends to run towards L3, L4. So they have to really pay attention to what they're doing when they're trying to do a spinal tap on infants. It's going to be more precise, more delicate. So this is something to think about. Okay, so moving on. This is the structure, kind of like looking down like a cross section if I cut away, right? So with this, there's not really too much I want you to be freaked out about memorizing here, okay? One thing that's interesting, I would kind of star is epidural space. Most of us, right, have heard of epidural, right? For causing numbness in the lower extremities for pregnancy. Very useful tool. But this is the epidural space. Basically, this space here, okay, between a certain layer of the spinal cord and this this is a very vascular fatty layer. So it gives us some buffer so that if you're putting needle in for epidural, you can place an epidural, give the medicine, and not necessarily end up damaging tissue because you got a little bit of a fat cushion, and it's going to be very effective at causing local anesthetic all the way down the legs. Okay, so lots of blood vessels, connective tissues, that sort of stuff. So the only other thing I mentioned too is we're going to talk about white and gray matter again, and when we talk about the brain, because the brain is made of white and gray matter too. But this white matter, gray matter, white matter appears white mainly because the abundance of myelin. Okay, so imagine increased myelin, so that's saying that there's more of oligodendrocytes and more axons because there's more myelin. Basically, it's what that's saying. So gray matter appears gray, and again, it's colored yellow, so to speak, in this example, just for contrast purposes. But gray matter, okay, is on the interior of the spinal cord, and it generally is less decreased myelin, basically. So you can imagine there's less neurons per square millimeter or something. I'm just making up numbers, but less myelin means less nerves in gray matter compared to white matter. Okay, that's kind of what we're saying, and that'll come up again. All right. So first look at kind of our layers. Good news, he is here. Excuse me, I keep yawning. The good news is here, right? We've got some of these. The ganglion is kind of a good word to know, but I'm not going to stress about you guys knowing that for this part. And this is showing like ganglion is like this joining point, right? The spinal nerves, and then spinal nerves are called spinal nerves because they go through. They're going to move from one place to the other. Okay, that's so to speak. So anyway, sorry about that. So spinal nerves, right? Pia mater, and then these are not too big. I'm not too concerned about these, okay? But secondarily, we've got this is showing us our first look at the three main layers that cover our central nervous system, including the spinal cord. And these are the same three layers in the same order that goes through our covers our brain. So, hey, that's good news. We've got the same thing labeled the same way, okay? Right? I like that. That's good news. So we've got pia mater, pia mater, arachnoid matter, and dura matter here. You see these? Okay. So pia mater is always going to be the innermost layer. Innermost meaning it's covering the actual spinal cord. And when we get to the brain, you'll see this too. Innermost is also covering the layer that's right next to the brain tissue itself in our brain. You can see here. Then you see on the kind of the outside of the pia mater, we have what they're calling the subarachnoid space. So it's below the arachnoid matter layer, but above the pia mater is the subarachnoid space. And then you can see this is where it houses our blood vessels, right? Okay. So we get through our arachnoid layer, which is our middle layer. The outermost layer that covers up our spinal cord is called the dura mater. Dura. So dura mater is outermost, arachnoid is middle, and innermost layer is pia mater. And again, this is the same for the brain layers. And this is called the meninges. Okay, you see it up there, meninges. Okay, well, actually, don't see it up there. Sorry, meninges. Okay, that's what you say when you say central nervous system layers. We're talking about the meninges. I did not do a good job spelling that. Sorry, guys. Meninges is characterized on these layers, and that's what we call the layers of the brain. Again, same layout. Dura being the outermost, arachnoid in the middle, and pia mater being the one that covers the actual organ. In this case, the spinal cord in this picture, but in the other case, the brain. Okay, so anyway, so that's our meninges, that sort of thing. Okay, so on the other regard to that, one of the other things is that I can't so innermost, yep, sorry, I keep getting phone calls. Anyway, meninges, innermost, arachnoid, outermost. Okay, so we're gonna move on to the next slide. But you will need to know those layers, their names, and you kind of have to put it in perspective. It helps you with the brain because again, it's the same thing, but just gotta know it. Okay. So this slide is kind of showing us spinal tracts. And again, I don't want you to memorize spinal tracts. Okay. Like all these layers, I don't know all these, but these are different functions. But what I do want you to get from this is that bundles of axons called tracts basically lie within, usually you can see the white matter. Okay. They serve as routes of communication basically to and from the brain. All right. That's what they're doing. Routes of communication to and from the brain. That's what I want you to think about. So this blue here, right? This dorsal column, you don't have to know the name. I'm just saying, you imagine this, okay, is like our moving up, right? This is our Also known as our sensory neurons or our sensory pathway, which is also known as what? Right? Afferent. Okay. Give me some slack here writing this. Okay. So this is a pathway up, right? To the CNS from the body. So this is sensations in this dorsal column. Again, you don't have to memorize these names. I don't care about these names. Okay. Don't worry about it. Don't stress. I just want you to have a concept of what's when you hear spinal tracts, you're thinking about a pathway for signals to be sent and received. Okay. Right. So the other pathway of this is the red here. This is the corticospinal tracts, but this is our basically our efferent tract, okay, with an E, our motor tract, okay. And so again, this is going this way, so to the body from CNS to the body, okay. And spinal tracts just kind of help keep everything in line. There's not just like a web of random uh there's not a web of random bundles of nerves along the spinal cord. It has a structure in a certain manner. So you can see kind of our spinal tracts again here, right? There's certain areas that they receive signals from an interneurons in the brain and do something about it. Okay. That's what I wanted you to see here. Nothing that you need to memorize these names or even just a concept of like if I hear spinal tracts, I know what we're talking about, if that makes sense. Okay. Same thing here. I'm not stressing about this picture. Again, this is relaying information, spinal cord to the rest of the body. What this is basically trying to show us is what the nerve looks like. And you can kind of see a word that comes back again. Fascicle kind of comes back here. You don't need to memorize this, okay? Don't stress about it. But this is just kind of showing you what is this bundle of nerve, like this big giant nerve coming off the spinal cord, the spinal nerve. What does it look like? And this would be like your cross section, okay? So spinal nerves, okay, when you say spinal nerves, what are we talking about? So spinal nerves is basically the name of these type of nerves that come off the spinal column and go to tissues somewhere and do a specific job, okay? So the word plexuses is interesting, but I'm not gonna you know, there's no reason that you have to stress about knowing it. I just think it's plexuses or plexus. Plexus is like a combination of different points that the spinal nerves come off the spine. Okay. The only key one that I'm going to harp on here. Okay. You ready for this? So you see this orange one here called the phrenic nerve. Phrenic nerve is a part of the brachial plexus. The phrenic nerve controls our diaphragm. Okay. What's our diaphragm? Do you guys remember? I'm not even spelling this right. I'm struggling. Lord have mercy. Well, whatever. Diaphragm. Okay. Diaphragm. It's rough. The phrenic nerve controls our diaphragm. We need our diaphragm for our lungs to move at all. Okay. Right. So if we don't have a functional phrenic nerve or it gets severed or we have an injury in our cervical spine somewhere along this brachial plexus, there's always a potential for phrenic nerve involvement. And that could always be a problem. Right. So if we can't breathe, that's usually a problem. So we want to make sure that we're up to date, kind of just, I like the only thing I highlight is that the name, the phrenic nerve, and it controls our diaphragm and controls breathing. So if we don't have it, we don't have a functional diaphragm, we can't breathe effectively. Okay. The rest of this, knowing the numbers for each of the regions and all for the plexuses, I'm not too worried about that. Sacral plexus is interesting in the sense that you can see they all come off and a lot of them end up in the sciatic nerve. And a lot of us have heard of sciatica pain and this issues with the sciatic nerve. It's interesting because the sciatic nerve is basically one long nerve kind of starting here, one long axon all the way down to the leg. Longest axon we have in the body. And so injury to that tends to linger and stay around often. So okay. Moving on. Dermatones. Not going to stress about the word dermatones or where all the dermatones are. I don't care that you know that much. So dermatones is just a way of saying, hey, here's our spinal, our spinal plexuses. Where do our spinal plexuses like kind of innervate into the skin? And so dermatones would be something you would know in as a diagnostician, someone that's trying to not diagnostician, but someone that's trying to diagnose somebody. So working as an NP doctor, that sort of thing. Dermatomes can be a useful test of figuring out if there's any deficits anywhere after a neurological injury or pain, radiation, those kind of things. But they're areas where the nerves meet the skin from those plexuses is what that's showing you. Don't have to memorize that by any means. Okay. So don't freak out. All right. Don't stress out on me, guys. Okay. So moving on. I thought I clicked the button. Sorry. So somatic reflexes. So if you weren't there on Monday, I demonstrated this, but you can demonstrate this actually if you let your leg rest a bit. Okay. Like let it loose, let it hang down to gravity, and then take your kind of hand and flatten it out. And you can hit underneath your patella, find your patella on your kneecap, go right below it. And then you can hit, if you let your leg relax enough, you can hit the nerve and make it kind of bounce up. We kind of mess with that. But so what's interesting about that? Yeah. Anyway, I mean, the really interesting thing about somatic reflexes is that you can really, this is how we kind of keep stuff going. But what somatic reflexes, the word is again, somatic being like motor, muscular, skeletal, those kind of things, is that they bypass, you can see there's a track, right? There's an impulse, hits the muscle fibers and the nerve fibers, goes to the gray matter in the middle, the CNS, the spinal cord, bypasses, never goes sensory all the way up to the brain, bypasses that and goes straight to a motor function of movement. And that's why this is just a reflex. I mean, we're not controlling it. It's not voluntary. It's somatic, being like muscular movement. Okay. And we need these reflexes mainly for things like keeping us alive, like as far as like we trip and fall and catch ourselves before we ever hit the ground. We didn't have to think about it. Thank goodness we didn't have to send a signal to our brain to like, oh, hey, catch yourself. Now, sometimes, when stuff happens, but let's move on to the brain, regions of the brain. Okay. So we've done, discuss it. We'll finish up discussing again the kind of autonomic nervous system and breaking it down a little further, but we've discussed that already. We've discussed the structure and classification of neurons and their supportive cells, glial cells, and what they do. And we've talked a lot about, spinal cord and the branches. So moving on, regions of the brain. Okay. This is where it gets a little complicated. We went through this fast again on Monday, but just stay with me. I'm going to try to highlight the big stuff here that you want to focus on. But this image here, regions of the brain, kind of gives us the big picture of the big regions. So cerebrum here is this whole thing. Okay. Our big kind of weird looking, almost alien. Our brain is an odd shape, but this whole thing, that's your cerebrum. Okay. This is where a lot of our cognitive thought happens, our reasoning, deduction, that kind of thing. We need a good cerebrum to do like higher level stuff that makes us human, basically. And we increase the surface area for more cerebrum by the way it's shaped. It has these ridges and these valleys, these ridges called gyri and these valleys called sulci, or excuse me, sulci. Gyri and sulci together increase the surface area by putting folds in the brain, so the cerebrum can have as much surface area as many neurons as it can. Okay, the other one down here is diencephalon, and we'll talk about it as a region, very interior brain, like right in the middle, surrounded by the cerebrum. Then we have our brainstem, and most people have heard the brainstem that has three parts that all do a little bit of different function. Midbrain on the top, okay? So again, brainstem, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, okay? Medulla oblongata is not just some kind of name made up from the Waterboy movie. If you've ever seen that, medulla oblongata is the name for this. This is like our core survival part of our brain, is the medulla oblongata. And then the last region to kind of for us to know is the cerebellum. Okay. It hangs off the back underneath undercarriage here of our cerebrum. Shares a similar name, which gets cerebellum and cerebrum confused for a lot of people. But cerebellum, I always think of the word bell in here. Cerebellum, and like this almost has like an acorn bell kind of shape to it, the cerebellum does, and it hangs off the brain, and that it's okay. So that's how I memorize it, the bell shape. So those are the big regions of the brain that you're going to want to kind of keep up with. Okay. So then the rest of this starts going through these different regions, and then, what makes them unique and how do you tell the difference? Right. Okay. So, sorry. Okay. Well, first, we're going to talk about, again, this is kind of like almost a review, but here we go again, right? Here's our layers of the meninges of the brain, along with the similar names and the similar layout of the meninges of the spinal cord. Thank goodness, at least something somewhat makes sense in this world, right? Thank goodness. So at least there's that. So our skulls out here is what this is showing us. Again, dura mater, okay, the outermost layer. It actually consists of, in the brain, at least two layers. You can see there's a space where there's fluid collection and other stuff happening here. Okay. This is known as the subdural space. Okay. Between the two dura mater layers, there's a subdural space. And then after that, we have our middle layer, the arachnoid matter. Excuse me, arachnoid matter stays in the middle. In between this, kind of covers up blood vessels, those sort of thing. And again, you can see our, and then our final layer is the pia matter. Pia being this last membrane right on the body of the brain itself, just like our spinal cord being the pia matter, meaning the closest, innermost. So again, pia matter innermost, arachnoid matter middle, dura matter the outermost, and in the brains and meninges, we've got a double layer, and there's a subdermal space, subdural space in between the subarachnoid spaces underneath the arachnoid between the pia matter. So these two, you don't really need to know these. Gray and gray and white matter. Again, gray is referring to this. So for the spinal cord, it's actually opposite, but for us, our outside gray matter is gray matter, meaning lacking myelin, right? Lacking abundance of myelin. It still has myelin, but just not as much. That means it's not a high concentration of brain tissues necessarily. So white matter is a higher concentration of central nervous system neurons in brain. That's why it's white, because it has more myelin. So again, just kind of like a reminder. I think there's a button to erase all this. Yeah, we'll get there, guys. Don't worry. Okay. So the other thing he wants to touch on is the ventricles. These ventricles have everything to do. These ventricles have everything to do with creation and maintaining CSF. Okay, maintaining, helping create is all they want to do. CSF, cerebral spinal fluid. They say, why do we care about cerebral spinal fluid so much? Yeah, sure, it's a great way to test for neurological conditions, that sort of stuff. Well, because of our blood-brain barrier, a lot of our central nervous system can only get oxygen and exchange CO2 and get some fluid. So this is like the meal. The rest of the CSF is like the meal for the brain, besides a normal O2, small molecules across the blood-brain barrier. So CSF carries glucose. Okay. Ooh, it's a bad L. Carries glucose and proteins. And we need glucose and proteins to do our normal function, right? Our normal metabolism, a normal cell division, a normal this, and that, along with the oxygen stuff. So we need both. That's CSF's job. Provide nourishment, glucose and protein. It also provides protection. Okay. You say, how does a fluid that is not that much of a brain provide protection? Well, for starters, our skull is immovable, right? It's not going anywhere. So if we have fluid buildup somewhere in our ventricles or along anywhere, or inflammation, disease process, tumor, anything like that, because of the fluid barrier around the brain of CSF, it helps keep our brain safe from things like minor head injuries, bumping our head where we don't get a full head injury, but because we got this buffer, basically. You don't have to memorize the ventricles, but just say, hear ventricles and you think CSF, okay? If that makes sense. I lost my mouse for a second there. Sorry, guys. And this is just an image that's kind of showing you how this is created and where it flows, basically. This structure here, okay, is called the choroid plexus, okay? So choroid. Let's see, was it plexus? Yeah, plexus. Choroid plexus. Okay, this is where CSF is created, basically. Okay, so then it gets created there and then runs this line all the way around. Again, you can see forming a barrier around our head to keep it safe all through here. Anyway, so I didn't mean to. Oops. Okay. So the biggest thing for CSF is thinking about what's its purpose. Well, protection, one. Also, the thing is nourishment, glucose and protein needed for the cells of the brain, and that's why we need them there. Secondarily, it's just really we're trying to keep our brain from hurting itself. So you need CSF. It's made. Again, also we'll talk about it in just a second. CSF is made, but it also has to be drained, okay, and recycled. You can't have the same CSF or cerebral spinal fluid your whole life. It's got to be recycled. So ventricles make it. Other ways of our lymphatic system and other stuff will help take it up, but generally we would just need to take it out. So sorry, I don't know what I was saying there. So Okay. So, what are the consequences if a nerve lacks a neural lemma? Again, trying to remember what a neural lemma was, right? What are the consequences if a nerve lacks a neural lemma? Hmm? So again, neural lemma was that layer that holds a nucleus on a Schwann cell. So that's your big hint. I'll give you a little bit longer to answer. Okay. Sorry about that. Gave you a little bit longer to get it talking about. My dog was distracting me in here. Okay. So consequences of nerve lacks a neural lemma. Nerve conduction is slowed. Nerve conduction is accelerated. The nerve cannot regenerate. If injured, the nerve will atrophy and die. So I think I already know where you guys already know what this is, right? The nerve cannot regenerate itself. That's the big key principle between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. Okay. That's the key big difference. So you got to hone in on that. Okay. Getting into these divisions of the brain. Okay. First one we're going to talk about is the brain stem. Okay. What this is showing us is that the brain stem is very interior, middle of the brain. This is showing us that this is an endocrine organ that is closely related to the endocrine system and our brain, but this is known as the thalamus. Okay. Thalamus sits on top of a brainstem. So we have the three parts: midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Okay. So we need all these parts. So the midbrain here up top is like tracks that relay impulses. Okay. Like a little super information highway filled with tracks that relay, sensory and I can't write all relay impulses. Okay. It also does, the book kind of references, it changes some auditory and visual reflexes. And some muscle control. But the big thing is like tracks for those impulse conductions. The pons below it, okay, conveys tracks that signals to and from different parts of the brain. Several cranial nerves arise from this area too. So you have to imagine like midbrain is like as the train station where sensory and motor information comes from peripheral nervous system and kind of gets here and then gets sent out where it needs to go. Where the pons is like cranial nerves that are in the head that go do certain things. Also, just other nerves that go throughout the brain kind of run through here as its grand central station. So the pons more focused about housing the cranial nerves and other nerves that feed other parts of the brain. Okay. And then the medulla oblongata, or generally you'll typically hear it not referred to the whole name. Medulla will be just referred to the, such and such medulla. Okay. That's what it's talking about. When you hear medulla, it's talking about the medulla oblongata. So the most inferior portion of the brain stem. There's three parts. Midbrain is the most superior, and then medulla would be the most inferior. And you can see this is what attaches to the spinal cord. We have our, brain tissue going on, brain stem, medulla, and then that turns into the start of our spinal cord as it goes out, right, of our head. Okay. So the medulla oblongata attaches the brain to the spinal cord, basically. I mean, all the brain stem is really attaching the brain to the spinal cord, but it really happens in the medulla. So it has a big weight of attaching the brain to the rest of the spinal cord. It also has the big job of kind of doing the big stuff that maintains us, maintains life. So it's the cardiac center, draw like a heart, okay, respiratory center, and also a book kind of talks about vasomotor center, which is like blood pressure control, dilating, constricting blood vessels. If any of those, whoops, that's not control, vasomotor control, if any of those things make sense to you, okay? So you hear medulla, you think like our core, just survival part of our brain. Like it's going to focus on keeping our heart going, keeping us breathing, keeping our blood pressure going, all that stuff. It's not doing a lot of thoughts or doing anything like that. It's regulating breathing, cardiac. It's trying to keep us alive. Very reflexive, okay? And there's also several cranial nerves that kind of start there, run through there. But its big job is to attach the rest of our brain to the spinal cord, and to regulate heart, regulate respirations, regulate blood vessels, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's our brain stem. Those three parts. Again, the thalamus is not included as part of the brain stem. It just sits on top of the midbrain. It's an endocrine organ by trade that does a lot of nervous system stuff. There's a lot of overlap, but this is just showing you the thalamus for perspective and for visualization. Okay. The cerebellum back here, hanging off the back. Again, the bell shape off the back of our head here. Okay. So cerebellum, you see hanging out back here. Actually houses the most neurons. Okay, this is a key interesting factoid that I would highlight. Okay, houses I said most more neurons. I'm just going to read it than the rest of the brain combined. So you think about how our brain is. That's really interesting. So our cerebellum in the back there has more neurons and connections than our whole brain combined. Okay, something like the book talks about approximately 40 million or something crazy like that. So what this cerebellum does is monitor body movements and sends messages for balance and coordination and posture. Okay. So signals received by our inner ear get tested through here and then gets paired and that sort of stuff. So it's interesting. So you think cerebellum, you think like posture, balance, coordination, that kind of stuff. Any issue with cerebellum, you're going to have that. And there's a chart in our book that talks about common these areas of the brain and common issues with those areas and what that would look like as far as what that would affect. Okay. So this is a deep inside the brain region. This is the hypothalamus. This is what's known as the diencephalon here. Diencephalon. Okay. And what this is this diencephalon contains the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So thalamus is what we saw earlier. That's on top of the brainstem here. Hypothalamus is like its appendage that kind of comes down here. These two organs are most influential. Sorry, can't talk. In our endocrine system and hormone regulation and balance and all that sort of stuff. So they're not too much affecting us for this chapter, but they're part of the diencephalon. They're part of one of the main categories of the anatomy of the brain. So the book mentions them here and wants you to kind of have an awareness of them. But again, resides deep in the middle of the brain. Again, thalamus is about relaying messages to complex things. Memory, emotion too are kind of toward in there. But the biggest thing I think is you think about hormone regulation, and the hypothalamus that's below it is, kind of nearly influences every organ because of that. Influences on the autonomic nervous system, influences on hunger, thirst, temp regulation, and influences on our pituitary gland, which is like known as the master gland. And we'll talk about that with the endocrine system. But for now, thalamus and hypothalamus, keep an eye on where they are anatomically speaking. Okay. Let's see. So we've got cardiac and respiratory centers are found in and I just said this, right? So let's see what's listed. Pons, cerebellum, diencephalon, medulla oblongata. So I'll give you a second. All right, you guys think you got the answer? Yeah, I think you guys got it for sure. Yep, medulla oblongata. Again, cardiac, respiratory centers. You think vital signs, vital functions, vital signs, vital functions. You think medulla, okay? Or medulla oblongata is the full name, medulla, okay? The reason it's not some of these other things, again, like rationale wise, okay? The pons conveys signals to and from other parts of the brain. The midbrain was more focused on interconnections from the rest of the body to the brain. That's not listed here, but I was kind of giving the breakdown of the rest of the brainstem. Cerebellum monitors body movement, posture, balance, those sort of things. And the bell at the back, kind of the back underneath our head. And the diencephalon is the structure that houses the thalamus and the hypothalamus, related to thirst, temperature regulation, but a lot of hormone relation. So moving on with the brain, okay? So the brain, here's the lobe. So we looked at the main structures of the brain. Now we're on to, this is the cerebrum. This is our big part of our brain that does a lot of the thought processes, cognitive thinking, reasoning, all this stuff. And we're going to get into what each lobe does, okay? But that is the cerebrum. All this whole thing is the cerebrum, okay? And then you'll see another part that's called the insula here, and we'll talk about that. So what we're going to do is kind of go through each of these and talk about generally what we're looking for. Again, cerebrum out of the parts of the brain or the structures of the brain we just looked at, diencephalon, brainstem, that sort of. This is the biggest, okay? So they are also, these lobes, right? And I mentioned this before, are named for the skeletal bone, they sit underneath. So if you can remember the skeletal bones of our noggin, of our cranium, of our head, of our skull, then you can definitely remember where anatomically we're talking about with injuries, okay, to certain lobes, right? So frontal lobe, okay, this lobe here governs voluntary movements, some memory, emotion, social judgment, decision making, reasoning, and aggression. Okay, so big things here for frontal lobe. Hear me here. Think reasoning and personality and aggression are kind of controlled in frontal lobe. So and again, a social judgment. So I guess the big thing is social judgment, decision making, reasoning, aggression, and I would kind of add characteristics of our personality, our frontal lobe, which is again here in the purple. Okay. Parietal lobe. Parietal lobe would kind of be considered this side again on either side of the brain. And we'll talk about the hemispheres of our brain in a minute. But again, imagine this is just mirrored on the other side of our brain. Parietal lobe is kind of consistent of all this. So concerned with receiving and interpreting bodily senses. Okay. So senses such as touch, temperature, pressure, pain. If you hear parietal lobe, think like pain and pressure. Okay. Under pressure. You know what I'm saying? Okay. So also this parietal lobe does that other people. If you remember from our chapter 12 sensory stuff, there was a receptor I mentioned, and I said we would see it again. Proprioceptors. I'm not spelling this perfectly, I don't think, but proprioceptors. You look this up in your book, okay? They are receptors that sense awareness of one's body or body parts in space as they relate to each other. So again, right now in my office, when I'm doing this, I'm picking both my arms up. I put my left hand down. My parietal lobe is sensing that I still have my right hand up, and it's understanding that that's my right hand. There is a certain condition or injury to the parietal lobe could cause someone to potentially, depending on where the injury was, to almost forget their whole hand exists or something like that. Forget a whole limb exists. Like they can't tell it's there. They have no sensation that they have this right arm or left arm or whatever. That would be an injury to the parietal lobe. Okay. Occipital lobe back here is underneath the occipital bone, right? Occipital is pretty simple. We've talked about it before, analyzing and interpreting visual information. Okay. So again, signals sent there to be analyzed and interpreted for visual. Temporal lobe, again, under the temple, it's kind of around where the ear is too, under the brain. So we can probably guess what it governs or what that temporal lobe is doing. So hearing, but also you're going to add smell in there, some learning and emotional behavior. And the big things I would think I would highlight would be temporal lobe is governing or effectively controlling hearing, smell, and visual recognition, meaning that like visual recognition, meaning not like your occipital lobe that analyzes information, meaning like you see fine and you see a coffee cup, but you can't tell me it's a coffee cup. You can't remember if there's an issue with your visual recognition and your temporal lobe. You wouldn't be able to tell me it's a coffee cup. You just know what it is, maybe even know how to use it, but specifically to look at it and have visual recognition of what it is, you wouldn't be able to. Okay. The last is the insula, which they show us by pulling apart the these two lobes here. You pull this apart and you've got a system called the insula on the inside. The insula is kind of hidden underneath, but it's several different functions. Basic emotions is one thing, including joy, happiness, anger, and disgust. Addiction and kind of self-awareness. So insula would be more like the addiction center. Okay. Well, I can't write it all, but addiction and self-awareness, along with very, very basic emotions, joy, happiness, anger, disgust. Moving on. So those are your lobes of your cerebrum. Now, again, we've looked at the parts, right? Our cerebrum is one of our structures of our brain. Down here, we've got our cerebellum. We've got our brain stem. That's our main parts of our brain. But if you talk about cerebrum as its main part, it has these 5 lobes that have specific reasons. So there's a chart that talks about if there's an injury to my frontal lobe or an injury to my parietal lobe or blah, 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 I'll have this kind of thing. So I would highlight that chart and look at it because it kind of helps you say, okay, they have this wrong. And if that lobe does this, then it makes sense why, they're struggling with this or that person or whatever, they're injured. Okay. So all this is really telling us this is like a slice of our brain looking up at it. And you can see, the outside's got our gray matter and then the white matter on the interior for the most part. And again, this kind of shows us that we have 2 hemispheres that I'm going to talk about at some point too. But Also, here's the thing. The one thing I'd like you to know from here is we have this thing called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum, we have two hemispheres, two sides of our brain that are divided down this midline fissure. The corpus callosum is a bundle of nerve fibers, okay, here, this is what's green, that connects, it's like a bridge that connects these two hemispheres. Without the corpus callosum, you would lose function or ability to communicate with both sides, which would be actually, apparently there was some old ways of treating depression, anxiety that not necessarily a thing anymore, but would be severing the corpus callosum to try and fix that. And we could talk about that in class, but it's interesting. So just hear me there. You want to know the word corpus callosum, that is talking about a bundle of fibers that connects the left and right hemisphere. Okay. So the next, like, not last, but the next big system we want to talk about is the emotional brain, which is what's the limbic system. Okay. Limbic system is also AKA emotional brain. It has basically two parts to it. The hippopotamus, no, I'm just kidding. Hippocampus. Okay. I just think of hippo plus college campus. Hippocampus is what converts short-term memory into long-term memory. So again, me remembering stuff that happens in the moment, like, the fun I had when I went snow skiing or whatever. But me sitting back now and remembering that, because it was like 3 years ago last time I went snow skiing, me remembering that is converted to a long-term memory, and that's the hippocampus job. Amygdala is how you say that, like Amy Gilda, I guess you could say, but amygdala stores and can recall emotion. So the amygdala is more associated with, like, it's where this emotional brain comes from. The hippocampus some too, but the amygdala, oh goodness, excuse me, sorry guys. The amygdala is also kind of what's associated with helping us recall memories. And also imagine the amygdala is associated with, you think, memories that recall emotions. So like, again, why, if you think about, if you have a loved one or a family member that's passed away and you start thinking about them and their memory, you get sad and upset and cry, or in that regard, that would be your amygdala is working. Okay. That's where you store and recall memory and recall emotion that are tied to those memories. So these work hand in hand pretty tangibly, and they can be affected a lot of times in Alzheimer's or dementia patients. And that's why those patients have terrible time converting short-term memory into long-term memory. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense.
The cerebrum, the big outer part of the brain with all these lobes, is all about you thinking and processing information at a high level. All the thoughts that you think, all the emotions and feelings that you have are taking place in that cerebrum. But in this video, we're talking about the internal structures of the brain. These are going to be structures that all animals have, and they're going to help keep us alive at a more basic level. They're going to control things like our breathing and heart rate, the maintenance of homeostasis throughout the body, and all of those other processes that we don't consciously think about, but that are super important for keeping us alive and healthy. We're going to be looking at a sagittal cross-section just like this, and we're going to cover the corpus callosum, the parts of the diencephalon, which include the thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and pineal gland, and finally the three parts of the brainstem. And all you need to understand this is this right here. So let's jump to the whiteboard. So like I said, this largest outer structure around the brain is the cerebrum, and it includes the frontal, parietal, occipital lobe, as well as the temporal lobe. And it's going to control a lot of higher order processes like processing information, making decisions, our emotions and personality, things that separate us from other types of animals. We humans have developed really large cerebrums in order to do all the thinking and thought processing that we do. Posterior and inferior to that, we also have the cerebellum, which is going to help us to maintain balance and posture, as well as coordinate all of our complex movements that we do. I covered all of that way more in depth in part 1 of this video, link in the description below. But for now, we're going to focus on these internal structures right here. The first I want to talk about is the corpus callosum, and it's the structure that's going to connect the two halves or two hemispheres of the cerebrum. We have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, and for a lot of functions, they work independently of each other, but they need to communicate back and forth, and they do that through a system of nerves that are here in the corpus callosum. Interesting fact about the corpus callosum, a lot of times when people have seizures really bad, one of the treatments for that is cutting the corpus callosum, which causes there to be two halves of the cerebrum that actually work independently of each other. Next, we're going to talk about 4 parts of the diencephalon, which include the thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary, and pineal gland. The thalamus, which is just inferior to the corpus callosum, is sort of a relay station between the spinal cord and the other parts of the brain.
It's full of a bunch of synapses or connections between neurons. Neurons from the spinal cord, which are bringing information up into the thalamus, which will connect to the dendrites of neurons in the thalamus to send those signals to whatever part of the brain they need to go to. If you've ever seen an old movie where the operator is directing people's calls to where they need to go, that's a really good metaphor for the hypothalamus. It's a relay station between the spinal cord and the various parts of the cerebrum. The next structure is the hypothalamus, which literally means under the thalamus. Hypo means under the thalamus. And even though this is a tiny structure in the brain, it's one of the most important. The thalamus is going to be the center of homeostatic control in the brain. This covers the regulation of many processes, including body temperature, water and electrolyte balance, hunger, digestive secretions, as well as helping regulate your autonomic nervous system, which includes your fight and flight or rest and digest response. And that hypothalamus is in charge of regulating all of those different processes. One of the ways that it does this is by controlling the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland right here is going to be an endocrine gland that controls all of the other endocrine glands, and it is controlled by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will send action potentials and hormones down to the pituitary gland to tell the pituitary gland what to do. The pituitary gland, in turn, then sends its own hormones out to all kinds of structures in the body, including all the other endocrine glands, to regulate those. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland really are a connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system, which are the two systems that are in charge of regulating and controlling your body. The nervous system doing that with action potentials in neurons, and the endocrine system doing that with hormones that travel throughout your body via the bloodstream. Finally, posterior to all of this, we have the pineal gland. The pineal gland is going to release the hormone melatonin, which is going to help you sleep better. Melatonin will calm the brain and make you feel nice and relaxed. And the name of that hormone, melatonin, comes from that prefix mela, meaning dark, and this hormone is released more whenever your environment is darker. So if you turn out the lights whenever you try to go to sleep, that's going to help you sleep better because your brain will produce more melatonin. But if the lights are on and you're trying to sleep, you have less melatonin production, and therefore it'll be harder for your brain to fall asleep. So that pineal gland is going to regulate your sleep cycle through the release of melatonin. Again, those four parts of the diencephalon were the thalamus, which works as a relay station between the spinal cord and the brain, the hypothalamus, which is in charge of regulating homeostatic processes throughout the body, the pituitary gland, which is going to control all of the other endocrine glands, and the pineal gland, which is going to help regulate your sleep cycle. Inferior to all of that, we have the brainstem. The first function of the whole brainstem is to be a pathway for signals to travel from the spinal cord down here up through to the rest of the brain. Just by their location, signals have to pass through that brainstem to get everywhere else. The brainstem has three parts to it, which include the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain, which is the most superior of these, is in charge of auditory and visual reflexes. So if somebody bumps your shoulder and you instantly turn, hey, I'm walking here, to see what was going on, or if you see something out of the corner of your eye and it causes you to jump, those are reflexes that are processed in the midbrain. And a reflex just means it's something that you're going to react to even before it gets up to your cerebrum, where you can consciously process and think about what just happened. In the case of these reflexes, information is sent from your eyes or your skin to that midbrain, and then straight back out to muscles to cause you to jerk or to move. And only after that can your frontal lobe and your cerebrum process what happened. The pons, which just means bridge in Latin, is going to be a site where information from the cerebellum is integrated with information coming from the motor cortex, as well as sensory information coming up from the spinal cord. Since the cerebellum is in charge of coordination, it needs sensory input as well as motor input so it can make corrections as needed so that we have better coordination. An example of that would be catching a ball. We need to be able to see and sense the ball as well as move our hands and body. And so that cerebellum and pons are crucial for hand-eye coordination and other coordinated movements. Finally, the most inferior part of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata, which is the cardiac center of the brain. This is going to regulate our heart rate, it's going to regulate our breathing, and it's going to regulate vasoconstriction, which is our blood vessels constricting, or vasodilation, our blood vessels relaxing. So think heart, blood vessels, and lungs when you think of the medulla oblongata. And most inferiorly, down at the base of the brain, is the spinal cord, which is going to take information up to the brain and send information out from the brain. Those are some of the major internal structures of the brain. Now let's do a quick recap. Pause the video and see if you can identify all of these structures as well as all of the functions that each structure does. We have the cerebrum, which controls thinking and information processing. We have the corpus callosum, which is going to connect the two hemispheres of the cerebrum and help them communicate back and forth. We have the thalamus, which is a relay station between the spinal cord and the cerebrum. We have the hypothalamus, which is the homeostatic control center of the body. That's going to control the pituitary gland, which is the gland that's going to control all of the other endocrine glands. We have the pineal gland, which is going to release melatonin to help regulate your sleep cycle. And those four structures make up the diencephalon. Inferior to that, we have the brainstem, which is a pathway of signals to make it from the spinal cord up to the rest of the brain. The brainstem has 3 parts. We have the midbrain at the top, which is going to control auditory and visual reflexes. We have the pons, which is going to be a connection between sensory and motor signals, and the cerebellum, which is going to coordinate those movements. And finally, we have the medulla oblongata, which is the cardiac center of the brain. It's going to regulate our heart rate, the constriction and dilation of our blood vessels, as well as our breathing. We have the cerebellum, which is going to coordinate your movements and help with balance and posture. And finally, the spinal cord at the bottom. So there you have it. If you haven't checked out part 1 of this video, I encourage you to do that and to learn all about the cerebrum and the cerebellum and more about how those work.
So again, we'll move on, but for his explanation too, again, midbrain is in a way a book art way as far as brainstem goes. Midbrain, again, our book kind of talks about being a relay station for motor function and visual stuff, but it's really a relay station where a lot of our nerves for inside our head, like our eye, our ocular nerve is going to run through there and then go to the occipital lobe. It's a kind of a relay station for our nerves. The pons is a relay station between there, and you can see here the cerebellum as far as posture, but also sending signals from our spinal cord is going to kind of come through here and other nerves. And then the medulla is going to be cardiac and respiratory center, and under the umbrella of cardiac, vasomotor center. So vasoconstriction, vasodilation, that sort of thing. Okay, so moving on. So this section here talks about sensory functions of our brain, or of our cerebral cortex, excuse me. So here's good news. I'm not going to worry about you knowing each of these and that sort of stuff. This gets too in depth. I think this is higher level stuff. We're not going to focus on this. I'm going to kind of brush through these slides, mention them, but I'm not going to, you don't need to know the sensory functions in each kind of area of the brain. Okay. The big things I want you to do is the anatomy structure of the brain. Again, going back, thinking about it, I want you to definitely know those kind of 5 big structures, or not 5 big structures, but the big structures: cerebellum here, again, brainstem and its parts, the cerebrum, and then all the lobes of the cerebrum, and kind of what you want to think about what they do and what you think about an injury might be to those parts of the cerebrum. Okay. And then within there, you have the diencephalon that includes the thalamus and hypothalamus, right? And then also wrapped around our diencephalon, we have what's called the emotional brain, the limbic system. Okay. Again, hippocampus and amygdala, hippocampus being associated with short-term memory converted to long-term memory, and, our amygdala being emotional connection to memory. Okay. So those are the big stuff. But again, I'm just kind of go through these. I'm just clicking through these. We're not going to focus on the motor functions and sensory functions of the cerebrum, but this is kind of showing you where they are. Again, same thing here. There's a next slides are breaking down language and where those areas are happen, but you can see kind of this pathway, right, from like the occipital lobe seeing something, translating it, and then as it works through our cerebrum, how that gets interpreted to words and things we understand, or how we talk and that sort of stuff. This is interesting to see, but I'm not going to focus on this at all. So you're good. You guys don't have to know this. Okay, going back to this, then we're talking about our question here is the limbic system is charged with what? And I kind of just mentioned it. I forgot. I didn't mean to actually mention it, but limbic system charged with what? And I'll give you a second to answer this question. All right, let's see what you guys thought here, right? So limbic system is charged with emotion and learning. Okay, so that's the hard part. You think a limbic system, again, emotion brain. It's in the AKA name, and the name that's usually in is listed as it's emotion brain. So out of these options, identifying location of pain would not be involved in limbic system. Planning muscle movements to form words, that wouldn't be it. Determining muscle movements to perform a task. This is a question from the book, but this is the limbic system: emotion and learning. So you think, again, memory conversion, emotion, learning, that's limbic system. Okay. So special senses. So this goes through our cerebrum areas that do our special senses. And again, kind of where they're located. You can see kind of olfactory, gustation here, auditory, sensation area. Makes sense by the ears. Don't stress about it. I don't want you to have to memorize this. Okay. You're good. Memory. This just talks about how we get it encoded, the pathway to it. this slide's interesting, but we're not focusing on it. Okay. So you guys are good there. So again, this is where he goes through and talks about our brain, our cerebrum and cerebellum, and kind of gives his thoughts on it. Now he goes in more depth, so he's got more stuff. This is a fun screenshot, by the way. So he's got more stuff. Again, focus on what I've told you to focus on. Don't stress about knowing everything. You can't know it all. You can't. But he goes more in depth, but I like his drawings, so we're going to use him. Okay. And we'll just kind of go through it. And then the last section of this chapter goes back to our nervous system, and especially our peripheral nervous system, PNS, and talks about the breakdown of our somatic nervous system, our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems in retrospect.
Did you know that different parts of your brain have different jobs or functions that they're in charge of doing? Maybe you did already know that. But let me give you a really cool example that I read about a few years ago. I read a book called You Don't Look Like Anyone That I Know. It's by an author named Heather Sellers, and Heather Sellers has a rare disorder called prosopagnosia, or face blindness. And she tells the story of running up to this man in the airport, her husband, and wrapping her arms around her husband and saying hello, and then she realizes it wasn't actually her husband. Now, how could she have made that mistake? Well, it turns out there's a certain part of our brain, and it's here in the cerebrum, and the whole purpose of that little section right there is to recognize faces. Now, she can still see faces and see different parts of faces, but you can't recognize people by their face, which is weird to think about. But if you think about it like hands, for example, if you saw this hand out of context, you probably wouldn't be able to say, oh yeah, that's the hand that belongs to that guy that does the science videos on YouTube. But maybe you could if you saw my face. So that region of Heather Sellers' brain is underdeveloped, and she never gained the ability to recognize people by their face. She would recognize people in other ways, by the way that they walked, or what they would wear, or just the context in which she would see the person. But that's an example of a certain region of her brain doing something very specific. And that's kind of the whole theme of this lesson. Different parts of your brain do different things, and there's a lot of different parts. So let's jump to the whiteboard and take a look at some of the main parts and some of their primary functions. One of the first things that you'll notice is that there's lots of folds and creases. These folds are called gyri, or gyrus for singular. So here's a gyrus, here would be a gyrus, there's a gyrus, everywhere a gyrus. And the little indentations between the gyri are called sulci, or sulcus for singular. So here's a sulcus, and I can run my finger up along that sulcus. So gyri are the folds, and sulci are the indentations into the brain between the folds. The sulci and the gyri are found on the cerebrum, which is this outer main part of the brain and the biggest part of the brain. The cerebrum has two hemispheres. We have a right hemisphere and then a left hemisphere. This is my right, this is my left. And in this video, we're gonna look at the lobes of the cerebrum in one diagram, and then we're gonna look at a sagittal cross-section in another diagram and look at some of the internal structures of the brain. So the brain that I'm drawing right now, we're looking from the side, or a lateral view of the brain. The left part of the diagram is the anterior side or front of the brain, and the right side is the posterior or back part of the brain. And I've drawn an eyeball here to help you see which side is the front. Get it? To help you see? I didn't intend that pun, but I'll take it. This front lobe, or frontal lobe, has a lot of functions. One function is executive functioning. Executive function is things like planning, organizing, or self-monitoring during a task. That's all taking place in your front lobe. So if you get disorganized, say, come on, frontal lobe, what are you doing to me here? It's in charge of your personality. Really, a lot of what makes you you is happening up here in the frontal lobe. And it's involved in higher order thinking and decision making. So whenever you do a complicated math problem or have an important life decision to make, you're using your frontal lobe of your cerebrum to make those decisions. One more function of the frontal lobe is it's the primary site of motor control. When I say motor control, I'm talking about movement. Think motor and movement. On the posterior side of the frontal lobe, we have a special section of the brain called the motor cortex, or motor strip. And all of your motor movements are going to be originating from that part of the brain and sending signals down throughout the spinal cord into your muscles to tell them to move. Just posterior to the frontal lobe is the parietal lobe, which is on the top or superior part of the brain. Whereas the frontal lobe, as one of its functions, was movement and control of movement, the parietal lobe's kind of the opposite. It's about information coming in or processing sensory information. That could be things like feeling hot or cold, touch sensation, proprioception, which is a fancy term for detecting where our body parts are located. For example, I can tell where my hands are right now, even though I can't see my hands. That's an example of proprioception. or kinesthesia, which is the detection of the motions of your body. So most sensory information is going to be processed by the parietal lobe, but also interpreted by the parietal lobe. We call those interpretations perception. So not only does it receive sensory information, but it also processes that and interprets it or perceives it. That's our perception. A good example of that might be feeling something brush my arm. If I already know my wife is in the room with me and I feel something brush my arm, I'm going to perceive that touch as, oh, that's just my wife. Or if I'm alone, I may perceive that touch as, oh, there's a bug crawling on me. Get off me. So those would be two perceptions of the same sensory information that our brain brought in. And finally, the parietal lobe deals with spatial reasoning. So being able to process things in 3 dimensions, or kind of geometric reasoning, or moving things around. That's all spatial reasoning. The most posterior lobe is called the occipital lobe, and it's got one primary function. We have a whole lobe for this, which is the processing of visual information, which is kind of weird that it's in the occipital lobe because that's about as far from our eyes as we can get. Occipital back here, and our eyes are up here. But information from our eyes is sent directly back to the occipital lobe. There we interpret that information and process it and decide what to do with it. An interesting fact about this is that our eyes actually send information across to the opposite sides of our occipital lobe. So the left occipital lobe processes what the right eye sees, and the right occipital lobe processes what the left eye sees. And in fact, that's the same thing for our motor cortex. When you move your right arm, that's a signal being sent from the left hemisphere of your brain. And when you move your left arm, that's a signal being sent from the right hemisphere of your brain. So if you ever get things backwards, hey, that's just how your brains are arranged. The fourth and final lobe is the temporal lobe, which is located on the lateral side of your head, right where your temples are. Temporal lobe. And that lobe is also right next to your ear, and it's going to process auditory information. So whenever you listen to your favorite song, that's being processed by your temporal lobe. Your temporal lobe also processes olfactory information, which is your sense of smell. So hearing and smell are both processed in the temporal lobe. And the third really important function of the temporal lobe is the processing and developing of memory. For many of us, music and also smells can conjure up memories of things that we've experienced pretty strongly. And it's no coincidence that all of those functions, memory, auditory processing, and olfactory or smell processing, all takes place in the same lobe of the cerebrum. When we talk about the lobes of the cerebrum, we're usually talking about the outer or superficial part of this called the cerebral cortex. But I want to dive a little bit into 2 structures of the limbic system, which are in the temporal lobe, but they're located much deeper inside the brain. The limbic system is associated with the processing of emotion, but it's also strongly tied to memory. So here's 2 structures I want to tell you about that are in the temporal lobe, in the limbic system, a little bit deeper in the brain. And those are the amygdala and the hippocampus. When I think of the amygdala, I think of anxiety and fear, but it also deals with the processing of memory. So whenever you feel strong anxiety and fear, a lot of times we'll remember those experiences, and that's all processed and encoded by the amygdala. And in fact, they've done experiments in mice where they destroyed the amygdala, and those mice are no longer fearful of their environment. Now, before you go out and destroy your amygdala, fear is important. We need to be afraid of things sometimes. Another structure that's part of the limbic system in the temporal lobe is called the hippocampus. The hippocampus takes your short-term memory and stores it as long-term memory. For example, the first time that you hear a phone number, you're not going to be able to remember that more than just a few seconds. But if you have to type in that phone number multiple times, your hippocampus will start to encode that into a long-term memory that you can then recall on whenever you need to. And there's other structures in the limbic system, but those are 2 of the most well-known ones. This next structure is not part of the cerebrum. Remember, cerebrum is the 4 lobes we talked about. This 5th structure is called the cerebellum, and it literally means little brain. It's located on the posterior side of the head and inferior to the cerebrum. The cerebellum is going to be all about coordinating your movements. I like to use the example of learning how to throw a ball for the first time. The first time you throw a ball, it probably looks something like this. But after you practice throwing a ball and you learn how to do it really well, suddenly you'll have a nice, smooth movement. Your cerebellum, on that posterior part of your brain, is responsible for coordinating those complex movements, along with the motor strip that we talked about earlier. The cerebellum also takes sensory information and combines that with the motor cortex in order to refine our complex movements. A good example of that is if you're walking on uneven terrain, you have to take the sensory information, the unevenness of the ground that you're walking on, and still coordinate your walking. Their cerebellum is responsible for that. The cerebellum is also involved in posture and balance. For the record, my bad balance was not due to a disorder of the cerebellum, but due to the fact that I have no control over my leg muscles. Also, if you laughed at a guy falling out of a wheelchair, shame on you. Just kidding, it's okay if you laughed. But I bet you don't forget that the cerebellum is in charge of balance now. So again, the cerebellum is in charge of the coordination of movement, as well as balance, and things like muscle memory. Muscle memory is really an inaccurate term, though. Your muscles don't really remember anything. It's your brain, your cerebellum in specific, that's remembering those complex movements and allowing you to do them over and over again. At the very bottom, we have the spinal cord, which is going to take information from the brain and send it down throughout the rest of our body through our nerves. Two more well-known structures of the cerebrum are involved in interpreting speech and forming speech. In the frontal lobe, we have an area called Broca's area. And Broca's area is where all of our speech patterns are formed. So all of the complex movements you do with your tongue and
Okay, I'm gonna leave those alone. Those are pretty well-known areas, but I'm not focusing on Broca's area or Nikki's area. Okay, so you don't have to stress about those. They are in your book if you want to review them, though. Okay, so stay with me here, guys. All right, moving on. So let's see here. We've got a section on the book that talks about sleep. I'm not going to focus on this. It talks about REM sleep and non-REM sleep. There's stages of sleep here and how that works, but really, you should just be familiar with what REM sleep is rapid eye movement, and non-REM sleep is non-rapid eye movement sleep. And this is where kind of dreaming occurs, where we get certain things done. So anyway, it's just without REM sleep, sometimes, this cycle here, the stage of sleep is good for us in a healthy habit. So I'm not going to stress about that. I'm not testing it over sleep, but it's interesting. One of the things, this next slide, though, is kind of somewhat important. And again, we know we have this big fissure down the middle that separates our brain into two hemispheres, and we have the same lobes on the other side. Occipital lobe is all this, parietal lobe, frontal lobe kind of includes all this. But again, corpus callosum, right? Remember that corpus callosum is what binds these two together, the bundle of nerve fibers that binds these two hemispheres together. Well, again, not only do the left and right hemisphere have an opposite, inverse cross-sectional relationship about controlling movement. So again, this is if you're looking down top on your brain, motor control for the right side of our body is on the left, and motor control for the left side of our body is on our right hemisphere. It's opposite. But generally, this is the general rule of thumb, is that you think of our left hemisphere as very analytical, logical, okay, thought, concrete, science, math. That's analytical, logical would be the two words that I would kind of highlight to think about left hemisphere. Right hemisphere, thinking about big picture, creativity, imagination. See, art and music is more what they're focused on. So creativity, imagination, big picture is our right hemisphere. Okay. So that's good to distinguish. A lot of times you're going to have to know that. So I'd keep up with just a general rule of thumb. The left hemisphere is more focused again on analytical, logical thought processes, language. Right hemisphere is focused on big picture, creativity, emotion, imagination. Okay, that's the difference. So this next section starts talking about cranial nerves. And again, good thing for you guys, I'm not going to make you memorize every cranial nerve because there's a lot. But again, I want you to hear cranial nerves and think we're talking still about peripheral nerves. These are nerves that end up or usually, start or end in the cranium in a way. Okay, right? But they're not a part of the central nervous system in the sense of they're not a part of the brain. Right? So, for example, you can see cranial nerve 1, 2. We've got the olfactory nerve and the optic nerve, and kind of where they go and what they're doing. And that makes sense, again, just to kind of help think that. But they're sensory nerves, right? They're afferent nerves. They're sending signals, okay? So they still are peripheral nerves coming up and sending signals to parts of our brain that do the interpretation. Now, the only thing I really want you to remember from cranial nerves is that there are 12 of them. There are 12 cranial nerves. If that's all you can remember, that's what I want you to remember. So how many cranial nerves are there? There's 12, okay? As far as the names and what they are, the general concept of when you hear a cranial nerve, you kind of have a general idea of what it's talking about. Peripheral nerves that are in the cranium, housed in the cranium normally, or end in the cranium, that send signals to our brain for interpretation or send signals out to help with movement for specific things. But that's the idea of cranial nerves, is that they're nerves that are just in the cranium, not necessarily, they're not central nerves, okay? So autonomic regulation is, again, we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system in this last part. The autonomic nervous system, again, is about regulation of a balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So again, maintaining homeostasis. Again, reminder from earlier on that slide that has the chart that breaks down our whole nervous system, including central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Autonomic, meaning automatic. We don't have to think about it. is predominantly our parasympathetic. The rest and digest part of our autonomic nervous system is generally in control, and the sympathetic, the flight or fight response part of our nervous system, autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic one is not as uncommon. It's more uncommon. It's going to burst when we need energy, burst when we need to move our heart rate up, that sort of thing, sending signals like that, but not always going to be called upon all the time. Called upon all the time. General rest and digest is where we are. So again, regulates homeostasis, sends impulses, cardiac and smooth muscle, that sort of thing. So this autonomic visceral reflexes, the visceral reflexes here, I do want you to kind of have a little bit of a, what was the word? I guess a reference point to visceral reflexes. You remember kind of reflex arc. Visceral reflexes are talking about, again, autonomic. We don't have to think about it. Just like our reflexes for the motor function reflexes. Okay. We don't have to think about this. Receptors tell our body something. So our receptors in our carotid arteries, our big arteries in our neck, tells our brainstem, tells the cardiac center in the medulla, say, hey, there's something we need to do. Afferent neurons then come out and transmit, or excuse me, afferent neurons from the baroreceptors in the carotid transfer a sensory impulse up, right, to the brain. So from body to the brain, tell the brain something. The brain in the cardiac center interprets that, signals a nerve down an effector organ is what they're saying. So effector, efferent neuron takes effort down to the heart to get it to pump faster or slower, depending on what we need. Okay, that's the visceral reflex. Visceral being, you hear visceral, you think organs like heart, lungs, liver, that kind of stuff, right? This is just giving you kind of a picture of the somatic pathway. Again, I'm not sure, again, autonomic pathway, right? Autonomic saying it usually has to do with some kind of receptor, like acetylcholine, dopamine, something, and then going out. You don't have to stress about knowing that, okay? So here's the kind of final part of this chapter. Divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Again, sympathetic, we're thinking about prepares your body for activity. So again, working out, okay? Stress, anger, fear, fight or flight, that is sympathetic. So the textbook contains a chart and comparing these two, and that chart in the textbook is what I would reference to help you kind of keep these straight. Again, sympathetic, you think increase heart rate, decrease gastric motility, because I mean, you wouldn't want to poop on yourself, right? Whenever you're in a fight or flight, whenever you have to run from a bear or a dog, you wouldn't want to your bowels to let go. So, or pee on yourself. So all that stuff kind of slows and contracts and restricts so that you can be ready to fight or flight or whatever's going on. So stress, anger, fear, increased heart rate, slowing down of our GI and GU activities, that sort of stuff. Okay. But again, parasympathetic is rest and digest, calms the body. But again, both of these work at the same time in homeostasis. Okay. Kind of providing feedback for each level in the background. It's that whole homeostasis of the autonomic nervous system is also what the book highlights is called autonomic tone. Okay. So just keeping this balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic. It kind of just depends on what the body needs. But general rule of thumb is that parasympathetic is the dominant section all the time, and sympathetic kind of comes in there when it needs to. Okay. Just reference that chart again for the specific differences of, heart rate's going up, my GI motility, what's going up, what's going down in each subsection of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. The rest of these slides are just kind of giving us, okay, here's the nerves that do stuff in the sympathetic nervous system, which makes sense. We talk about tear ducts and pupils dilating and organs like our lungs and, increasing breathing, increasing heart rate, all these functions. Okay. That makes sense. Bladder, GI, and the same thing kind of going the other way. Adrenal glands play a role. We're not going to focus on this because we're going to talk a lot about adrenal glands when we get to the next unit, which is chapter 13, endocrine. And so all about hormones and including the adrenal glands here, but they play a role because the adrenal medulla is what secretes norepinephrine and epinephrine, which have effects that we need in our body, but are really important in this autonomic tone or this autonomic regulation for the autonomic nervous system. So just here, adrenal glands here, but you don't have to stress about knowing this. Okay. And this kind of gives us the parasympathetic influence on things. Okay. And kind of here's that chart again, kind of from the book, right? Well, this is the chart they give in the book, but the chart before this that talks about these differences is good. This is more about where the sympathetic and autonomic systems come from and what they're doing. Again, think the chart before this of getting the actual what heart rate's affected, gastric is affected, what's actually affected. So you need to focus there. Okay. Not on this necessarily. I wouldn't focus here. I would focus on that. All right. If that makes sense. Okay. So he talks about the divisions here. I'm not going to stress about it because what he's doing here is, again, he's kind of breaking this down, this chart that we broke down in the first. But I will kind of go here. So we'll talk about where he talks about parasympathetic and sympathetic. If you want to see the full video, it's posted in D2L. You can see it.
And blood sugar and things like that. So now let's take a deeper dive into the autonomic nervous system, into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system controls your response to stress. I remember sympathetic and stress because they both start with an S. Think of a time where you were stressed out. You had a big test coming up that you were nervous about. You finally worked up the courage to tell that person that you really like them, like them. You're walking down a dark alley and you hear somebody come up from behind you. Whatever the situation is that you've been in that made you stressed, our bodies respond in the same way. So everything you see in this left column will be things that your body does whenever you're undergoing stress. Now, stress isn't a bad thing. Stress can be good. Stress can keep us safe when we're in a dangerous situation. It's all about our bodies responding appropriately to the given situation. This sympathetic response we call the fight or flight. It gets that name because a lot of times it's going to cause us to fight back against something or to maybe run away from something. The opposite of this is the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic is all the things that your body does whenever it's relaxed, whenever it's calm, cool, and collected. Yeah. This is often referred to as the rest and digest response. So everything you see in this right column are going to be the things that happen whenever your body's calm and not under any stress. So let's go through a bunch of examples. These first examples are going to be processes that are amplified whenever you're under stress. Our heart will start beating faster and harder whenever we're under a stressful situation. During the sympathetic response, we need our heart to beat faster because we need to get oxygen and nutrients throughout our body to power our muscles so that we can run away, so that we can fight back, so that we can be prepared for whatever we need to do. Compare that to a parasympathetic response. When we're relaxed, our heart beats slow and softer. Another sympathetic change is that our airways will expand. This allows us to breathe more, to breathe faster, and to get more oxygen into our bloodstream to power our muscles so that we can run away or whatever we need to do to survive. Under parasympathetic stimulation, our bodies are relaxed and we don't need to breathe as hard or as quickly. And so those airways will constrict a little bit. They don't need to be quite as wide open. Another response of the sympathetic nervous system is the dilation of your pupils. This allows more light to get in so you can more easily determine what's happening around you and you can stay alert and keep away from whatever might harm you. When you're relaxed though, your pupils will shrink and they'll let less light in because it doesn't matter as much that you see every single thing going on. You're in a safe environment. Under stressful situations, generally your alertness will increase. These are all the feelings of being afraid or scared and you're not in a safe situation and you need to get out of that situation. And so your brain will be on full alert. You're going to notice every little thing that might happen and you're ready to make a run for it if you need to. Compare that to parasympathetic. Alertness doesn't matter as much. You're going to be able to fall asleep easier, things like that. During stressful situations, a lot of times you'll start to sweat a little bit more. Your palms might get sweaty before you tell that person that you really like them. But during parasympathetic stimulation, your hands stay nice and dry. Now, all 5 of those sympathetic responses are things that our body needs to do whenever we're in danger. Evolutionarily, this might mean that there's a predator about to eat us, and we have to be ready to get away or to fight back. The next 3 responses, though, are examples of things that aren't very important when we're in danger. And so these responses are amplified whenever we're relaxed and calm and under parasympathetic control. The first one is our digestion. Think about it. You just ate a big meal, and then how do you start to feel? Oh my gosh, I ate so much I'm in a food coma. Why do you get sleepy after you eat? Well, your body's going to devote more resources to getting nutrients from that food, and so you start to feel sleepier. But whenever you're stressed out and in danger, your body's not going to donate resources toward digestion. You don't need to get nutrients right now. You need to not die or not fail your anatomy test. Another example is our immune response. If an organism is fighting for its life, it doesn't need to worry about viruses and bacteria and fighting off pathogens at the moment. Right then, it needs to worry about staying alive in the moment. But after that organism is no longer in danger, suddenly the immune system is very important. And the body needs to donate resources toward fighting off any bacteria or pathogens or things that might have gotten into the body. But during stress, forget about it. It's not the most important thing right now. Another example is sexual function. Sexual function is generally increased when an organism is relaxed and calm and not in danger. But when somebody's in a dangerous situation or they're feeling stressed or uncomfortable for some reason, sexual activity generally is diminished. This is not a comprehensive list of different sympathetic and parasympathetic responses. There's a lot more than this. The key takeaway in all of this, though, is to know that your sympathetic response is the stress response. And these are the things that happen that keep an organism alive in the moment when they're in danger. And then the parasympathetic is the opposite. These are the responses that the body has whenever things are relaxed and calm and the organism is not in a stressful situation. So these were the divisions of the nervous system. It's one system that's all interconnected. But whenever we break it down into these different parts, it helps us to understand what's going on a little bit better.
Okay. So like I said, if you want to watch the full video, it's posted on D2L. But I think for our purposes for this lecture, getting long, we're gonna do that. And I think we're gonna got mostly practice questions for the rest of it. Okay. You're hanging with me there. So which of the following is an action of the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system? I'll give you a second to answer. All right, here we go. What do you guys think? It's actually constrict bronchial tubes. Okay. So the rationale, and this is a question from our PowerPoints and stuff. What is it giving you? Okay. Well, sympathetic division increases heart rate, stimulates sweat glands, inhibits intestinal motility. Again, inhibit means to slow down or stop or delay, right? Intestinal motility means stomach, intestines, colon, all of it increase, having a motility means it's moving to move stool out the body. Well, we don't want that to happen or we want that to happen naturally in parasympathetic, but we definitely don't want intestinal motility going up in sympathetic. So inhibits. No, that's where it's going there. All right, next question. What white matter appears white because of its lack of myelin, its abundance of myelin, its preponderance of neuron cell bodies, a preponderance, or the presence of the meninges? So you can also pause the video to give yourself some more time, and that's probably what we'll do. So here's your answer. Let's see if you guys got it. Yes. So white matter is abundance of myelin. Gray matter is lacking. It's low amounts of myelin. Okay. So meaning there's a lot more, nervous neurons with a lot more myelin. Okay. Which nerve stimulates the diaphragm for breathing? Femoral nerve, the median nerve, sciatic nerve, or the phrenic nerve? I'll give you guys a second, and you can always pause the video as well, so you can have more time to think about the question answer. Right. So what's the answer? Dun, dun, dun. See if you guys picked the right one. Phrenic. That's right. Oh, you remember one nerve coming off anywhere. Phrenic nerve comes off the brachial complex or brachial plexus, excuse me. But I don't care about that as much as you hear phrenic, you think diaphragm. Without the phrenic nerve, the diaphragm doesn't work. And without the diaphragm, we don't breathe. And then without breath is death. Okay. Right. So keep that in mind. All right. So next question. Which portion of the brain contains the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, or the medulla? Is that 1, the cerebrum, 2, the diencephalon, 3, the cerebellum, or 4, the brainstem? Again, give you a second, but you can always pause the video to give yourself more time. Okay. So, let's see what you guys chose. Brainstem. That's right. Brainstem connects the brain to the spinal cord and has 3 components to it. Okay. Next, the type of neuron that connects afferent neurons to efferent neurons are monopolar neurons, interneurons, radical neurons, bipolar neurons. Again, pause the video if you need more time. All right, survey says the right answer is interneurons. Again, afferent neurons with an A are sensory. They're sending sensory signals from the body to the central nervous system. They connect to interneurons, mostly in the brain, other areas. Those neurons then do the interpretation. They're the thinking man's neuron, okay, the interneurons, and they send the signal down an efferent neuron for efferent, which is motor, okay, and that goes to that neuron goes, and bam, you get a reaction, whatever it is, okay, whatever you need to do motor wise or muscular wise, okay. The innermost membrane covering the brain and the spinal cord is called, so again, innermost, dura mater, pia mater, arachnoid matter, or cerebral matter. Give you a sec. All right, pause the video if you need more time. Answer is pia mater, okay? Pia mater is the one that is the closest. So that's the innermost layer. And again, same for the brain, same for the spinal cord. After that, the arachnoid is our middle, and then dura mater is the one that's going to be closest to the outside. In this case, the brain would be the skull and all that, okay? Dysfunction in which lobe of the brain could cause the patient to ignore objects on the opposite side of their body or even their own arm or leg and have specific issues with sensation and touch? I'm saying, give me a minute. 1 is occipital lobe, 2 is parietal lobe, 3 frontal lobe, or 4 temporal lobe. See where you're at. Give you a minute, or you can pause the video, give yourself more time to think. But again, use these questions as a challenge to think through what you've learned in this lecture, what you heard on class this past week. You know, try to put it together. Challenge yourself here. Don't look it up. All right. Here we go. Answer is parietal lobe. Okay. So parietal lobe has that weird phenomenon, basically, that it is possible for, again, parietal lobe is like pain, sensation, touch, right? Pain for P, but also this understanding of where our body is in the world too, as well. Okay. Not just balance, but just a physical feeling of knowing our arm is there. Okay. Stuff like that. And so a patient having any tumor and issue there is a weird phenomenon where they could lose kind of all insight to one side of their body depending on where the tumor is, which is kind of wild, but interesting. The axon of an afferent neuron could synapse with, so again, the axon, a gland, skeletal muscle, a sense organ, an interneuron. So let's think about it. Think about it for a second. Challenge yourself. Pause the video if you need to. Okay. Ready for the correct answer? Let's see if you guys are right. An interneuron. Ooh, okay. So let's think about it, right? So the answer is an interneuron, okay? So if think about it, remember I told you guys too, with you have the cell body that has the dendrites on it, the dendrite side of a neuron, and then you have the axon side, okay? And it stays in the same line. They go through the same line. The axon is always connecting with the dendrite of another neuron, okay? Well, if I have an axon, so that's the distal end, right? of an afferent neuron. Well, I know afferent is sensory neurons. So sensory neurons or afferent neurons are only sending signals from some sensation in the body to the brain, and the interneurons are in the brain. So these answer choices, right? My axon couldn't connect with a gland because that would be an efferent neuron targeting a gland to do something. Skeletal muscle would be the same thing. That would be an efferent neuron, meaning the neurons coming down from the brain, ending up connecting to a skeletal muscle to, again, make it do some effort, make it do something. A sense organ, you're like, well, an afferent neuron is a sense. It is. But what kind of portion, if the neurons only go one way, think about the portion of the neuron that would be connected to the sense organ. That would be the dendrites would come off the sense organ. And then the axon of that first one would then attach with the next one, and so on and so forth, right? So the only answer that makes sense is that this axon of the afferent neuron is synapsing with an interneuron, okay? So that's a higher level question, but it's possible to get, okay? Okay, so this last one would be match each brain lobe to its key function. Now, again, you guys can't really do this. I don't believe the WooClap while we've been doing this lecture. I'd have to have it up and running, I think. I'm not 100%. I think so, because I'd have to be, going on this. So anyway, so with that said, you can kind of go through and do this. So we can talk through it a bit. So number 1 says emotional social judgment. And I didn't spell right. That's bad. And decision making. Number 2 says analyzing and interpreting visual information. I bet you guys know where that one is already. Number 3 is hearing, smell, and visual recognition. Okay. 4 is interpretation of touch, sensation, temperature, and pain. Okay. Let's think about it. Why don't we start from the bottom? Started from the bottom. Now we're here. Okay. Number 4, interpretation of touch, sensation, temperature, and pain. What are we thinking? I'm hoping that you guys are shouting at home if you're watching, right? So I heard the pain, touch, sensation. 4 goes with B, the parietal lobe, actually, right? Hearing, smell, visual recognition. Now, hearing and smell are close in proximity. What lobe is close to hearing? Right? Temporal, because our ear canal runs through the temporal bone, and the temporal lobe is underneath the temporal bone. So hearing, smell, visual recognition, A, temporal bone. Analyzing, interpreting visual visual information, most of you know that as the occipital lobe. Then finally, emotional, social judgment, decision making, and you could throw in personality would be temporal. Okay. So that is it. That is their nervous system. Chapter 11, that's your chapter 11 WooClap and PowerPoint presentation in your lecture, okay? So this should have been everything we've already talked about, plus adding a little bit more, letting the videos play, adding a little bit more explanation, right, of what we're trying to accomplish with this. So the biggest thing is that with nervous system, you get down those few things, right? The few things that the test questions we kind of just practiced are pretty good. The general information you want to focus on is not so much where language is processed, all those kind of things. You want to focus on the big areas, the big breakdown of the brain, okay? The nervous system, the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and definitely the difference between our autonomic nervous system branches, sympathetic and parasympathetic, and then also just the general idea of the structure of a neuron and the difference between afferent and efferent neurons. Okay, this is a lot of information. I know it's tough, but you can break this down. I promise you can do this test. You can do this. If you got any questions, email me anytime. And I guys hope you have a blessed day, and I hope that this was somewhat helpful to you guys. Okay, but you guys have a great day.